Welcome back. We're discussing some of the biggest international stories with our panel of international journalists. Still with us, Afshin Molavi is editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. Peng is the correspondent with CGTN, and Dave Keating is an international journalist based in Brussels. Afshin, I want to get your take on the Dutch election. Geert Wilders, of course, didn't do as well as expected, but his party did get the second highest number of votes. So is there a message there, do you think, for the European establishment?
Yeah, I think there certainly is a message there, and I think, and I agree with Dave that it's hard to take individual cases of elections and then to draw a Europe-wide message. But having said that, there is this populist nationalist wave. There is a palpable sense of discontent and frustration, particularly in the hinterlands or the heartland, or however you want to describe it. And there is a divide between the urban, metropoles and these hinterlands and heartlands. And these hinterlands and heartlands have been crying out. We've heard it in Brexit. We heard it here in the United States, and we're hearing it in Europe as well. But one thing that did happen, Anand, that was very interesting is the polls turned out to be right. Wilders was losing a momentum towards the end, right. And then he ultimately did. And the polls in France show that maybe Marine Le Pen can win a first round, but the polls in France show that it's going to be very difficult for her to win the presidency by winning the second round. And so I think that's one lesson to be learned, is because we've been beating up on these polls, these pre-election
right.
polls for so long, that in this case the polls proved to be right.
Now, would it be fair to say that one of the common threads running through all this, if we look at Brexit, if we look at the Dutch election, if we look at the election here in the United States, is immigration?
It is, very much so. And I'm glad you brought that point up, Anand, because that's not going away. Yeah. No matter how you view the Africa rising narrative, we're seeing fast-growing populations. They're going to continue to move from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe, and we're going to continue to see Middle East migration. That's not going to end. It's going to continue to roil European politics.
Right, as long as we still have all the instability in the Middle East as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Peng, how does China see this phenomenon of populism that we see in the United States and in Europe as well? I mean, the most glaring examples, of course, was the election of Donald Trump, and in Europe, Brexit.
Well, yes, Chinese are concerned that this wave of populism will negatively affect globalization. That's the chief concern. China needs to export their products from its strong manufacturing industry, which is now already suffering from industrial overcapacity. For Chinese, it's very ironic that globalization started from the West and was once advocated strongly by the West, but now it is the West again to resist it. Another concern for China is the anti-China sentiment in this rising populism. Like many other Chinese, I watched this film, Death by China, or read this book, The 100 Years Marathon, by Defense Ministry, by the U.S. Defense Policy Advisor Michael Pillsbury. They are both typical advocates of the anti-China populism. As a Chinese, I could spend a whole hour refuting many of its logic flaws and fact mistakes, but still, many Chinese are wondering how films or books or any opinions like this are being received by the Western people, and we would like to hear from other guests about this.
Right, Dave, looking at the immigrant problem in Europe, Brexit was to some extent driven by the sentiment against immigrants coming to Britain. Well, these were people from the European Union, actually, who were moving to Britain. We heard the same in France. We heard the same to some extent in Italy. We heard the same in Holland, of course, during this election. What is the feeling in Europe now? Do you think the doors are going to be slowly closing to immigrants, to refugees?
I think one thing that was interesting in the final stages of the Dutch election was this dispute between the Netherlands government and Turkey. This was over whether or not current ministers in Erdogan's government in Turkey could come to the Netherlands and campaign for votes among Turkish people living in the Netherlands. The Dutch government said no, they can't come. They turned away some ministers who had come there to campaign, and this was hugely popular with the public. Now, some people are saying that you can attribute Prime Minister Rutte's success in the election to his decision to get tough with Turkey, and that bleeds over into a larger fear of immigration, that people wanted to see their leaders getting tough on immigration, getting tough on countries like Turkey. It's hard right now to know to what extent the developments with the Turkey issue over the past 2 weeks have had to do with Rutte's success. But I think there is a feeling among the European public that the migration situation, certainly from the conflict zones in the Middle East, is out of control. And they want their leaders to take decisive action. And Rutte's decision this week to halt the Turkish ministers gave that impression. And that's what people are kind of thirsting after.
Right, and Afshin, here in the United States, of course, Donald Trump tapped into what was seen as widespread voter unhappiness with immigration in this country. You know, he started talking about walls and imposing travel bans. Well, he did impose that initial travel ban that was thrown out by the courts. Now he's revised that, reissued that travel ban, and the courts have stepped in again, said this is not legal, it violates the Constitution. So what happens next?
What happens next is that they'll probably go back to the drawing board. They'll either try to come up with another ban, or they'll begin the judicial process. And Donald Trump has said he's going to take it to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. I mean, on the one hand, he's also going to use this as a political football, right? Because what he can argue is he can say that, look, see what I mean? There's an establishment elite who don't want us to do the things that you elected me for. And he's going to continue to run this, all around the country, and he'll certainly take some advantage from this.
I mean, he will find resonance with that kind of view among his base,
yes,
but not throughout the country.
No, not throughout the country. And and remember again, he did lose the popular vote. So
right.
it's a deeply divided country. And as you know, and from living here, I mean, Donald Trump can cure cancer, and there will be some who will say, he must have some business interest, in curing cancer. So it's a deeply divided country.
One other point is that if they go the legal route and say they want to go to the Supreme Court, that's not something that's going to happen very quickly.
Oh, no, not at all, not at all. That'll take a long time.
So we could see a long, drawn-out legal process.
It very well could be. And, this is a, welcome to an independent judiciary. This is a good thing. I mean, there was no rhyme, reason, or logic to this travel ban. And corporate America doesn't like the travel ban. And frankly, I would argue that most Americans, and even Trump-based supporters, were not rallying for him to do this kind of immigration ban. And, they wanted him to do, quote unquote, something about immigration. It wasn't just to cut off 6 countries. And what he's doing is essentially, he's taking 6 countries, penalizing citizens because their countries live, because they live in countries that have adversarial relations with the United States. You can't say these are the most autocratic countries in the region. There's others that are autocratic as well that are not on this ban because they have good relations with the United States.
Yeah, let me get Dave's view on this. Dave, how is this travel ban seen in Europe?
I think the effect on tourism, it's early days, but the initial evidence is that it is having a negative effect on tourism interest. I know the data has shown that internet searches for flights from Europe to the U.S. are down. I can certainly say anecdotally, I hear from friends here in Europe that they are not interested in going to the United States based on what they're hearing about what's happening at the border. It just kind of gives a general impression of a country that doesn't welcome foreign people, and that makes both vacationing in the United States and moving to the United States a less attractive prospect.
Right. Peng, we've now been almost 2 months into the Trump presidency, and as we noted, from Beijing to Brussels, everyone's watching this president very, very closely. What's the biggest takeaway in China on the new president?
Well, in China, 2 words, protectionism and uncertainty. On protectionism is the trade and globalization that is hard. We have talked about this. Donald Trump has threatened to raise Chinese products by 45% on his tariff. And Donald Trump has also said that the wealth of the middle-class families in the United States has been ripped from the families and has been redistributed around the world because of globalization. So a lot of anti-globalization sentiment in the Trump's ministry. And also on uncertainty is more about Trump's China policy. One rising power and one resident power is the most consequential relationship in the 21st century. He was very tough against China before his inauguration, saying that he will label China as a currency manipulator, things like that. But after he officially became the president, he seems to tone down a little bit. So a lot of uncertainty on this. We'll have to take wait and see.
All right, and then brings us to our last segment in this show, and that is, as we usually do, ask you for the next big story. Afshin.
Is the global economy turning a corner, Anand? You know, we saw emerging markets, grow at about 6.8% according to the Institute for International Finance in February on an annualized basis. We are seeing some signs of life. Certainly in the U.S. economy, the Dutch elections could have taken some of that risk premium out of investing in Europe. Are we turning a corner towards a synchronized growth of the global economy? Where we're not in this new normal of sluggish growth. I think that's the next big story.
The Federal Reserve said that the other day, very plainly.
That's right.
The economy is getting better.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
right. Dave, from your vantage point in Brussels, what's the next big story?
I'd say the next big story for Europe is going to be the triggering of Article 50 by British Prime Minister Theresa May. This is the mechanism by which the UK actually officially starts leaving the European Union. She was supposed to trigger it just about a couple of days ago, but was upstaged by Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, who announced that she was requesting a second independence referendum. And so that kind of threw the British government for a tailspin. They're now saying they will not allow a second referendum in Scotland for independence. And so the ball is now in Sturgeon's court. It's kind of a mess right now. But this Article 50, at some point, probably in the next week, most 2 weeks, will be triggered. And that's the official beginning of the negotiations.
Okay, Peng, I've got 30 seconds. What's the next big story?
We believe that dealing with the DPRK is definitely a big story. THAAD is now being deployed in the South Korea. China is straining its relations with the South, but it's also straining with its relations with the North for trying to stop the DPRK from the nuclear test. And Pyongyang seems very isolated at the moment, but China is technically still a military ally of Pyongyang. So we'll see how the 6 countries relevant to this will react and interact on this.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and that's all we have time for. Thanks for being with us.